This is Sydney Harbour, one of the most iconic and recognisable places not only in Australia but perhaps the entire world. Now I'm sure we're all familiar with this sort of view. You've got the Sydney Opera House with the Harbour Bridge in the background. It's a view that you'll often see in movies, on posters, or perhaps in real life if you've ever been to Sydney or lived there. But what if I was to take you back in time some 66 or so years? Well, this is what the harbour looked like. The Opera House hasn't yet started construction, as this began in March of 1959. It wasn't for another 14 years that we'd eventually get to see the site that we're all familiar with today. Weather, changes in government and political fallouts meant this project took much longer than what was anticipated. But on the 20th of October 1973, the Opera House finally opened by none other than perhaps the most famous woman of all time. Any guesses who? It was in fact the late Queen Elizabeth II. But if we travel back some 40 years prior to the start of the construction of the Opera House, this is how Sydney Harbour looked. There is not only no Opera House but no Harbour Bridge too. It looks completely unrecognisable. The bridge somehow took 6 years fewer to complete than the Opera House. It was finalised in 1932 and today is perhaps one of the most recognisable bridges on Earth. This is Christ the Redeemer in Rio, Brazil, a wonder of the world and one of the most famous statues on the planet. Excluding its pedestal, the statue stands around 30 meters tall, which is pretty impressive. However, it's not the tallest statue on Earth. And in fact, it's not even the tallest statue of Jesus. That title belongs to Indonesia, who built a 61-meter tall statue of the man himself. Now, I really didn't expect Indonesia to build a statue of this caliber, due to the fact that the vast majority of the population are Muslim. Shots like this are world famous. As mentioned earlier, it's one of the 7 wonders of the world, and you'll often see it in movies, posters, or on postcards. But here's something you might not have ever seen: Christ the Redeemer under construction in the 1920s. The foundation was laid in 1922 and it took 9 years to complete. The project cost about $250,000 back then, which adjusted for inflation is around $4.5 million today. That is a total bargain, especially when you consider that around 2 million people visit the monument every single year. Since it opened in 1931, the statue is estimated to have generated around $8 billion. That's from ticket sales, transportation, hotels, restaurants, etc, etc. And whilst we're on the topic of Rio, you probably recognise views like this: lush green hills and mountains surrounding the harbour. But it wasn't always like this. Back in the 80s and 90s, the area looked much different. The local flora was either destroyed by humans or killed off by pollution from harmful waste in the soil. Luckily, the city of Rio took action to reforest the area and clean up the mess. Whilst we're on the theme of famous statues, there is another which could give Christ the Redeemer a run for its money as the most famous on Earth. It is no other than the Statue of Liberty, which in itself is perhaps the most iconic attraction found across all of the United States. Now, many of you might be aware that the statue was gifted to the Americans by the French, but why exactly? Well, it was a gift to commemorate the alliance between the two countries during the American Revolution. So this is how the statue looks today. It sits on Liberty Island within New York Harbour. It sees over 4 million visitors per year. But this isn't always how it looked. When the statue was unveiled on a rainy day in October of 1886, it wasn't green as we know it today. It actually looked like this, with a more reddish brown look to it. This is due to the fact that the statue is made out of copper, but then over time, due to oxidation, the copper turned green. Here are some extremely rare and somewhat unsettling photos that you've probably never seen before. The statue when it was under construction back in France. The statue was fully constructed in Paris by the same guy who designed the Eiffel Tower. But if it was constructed in France, how did they then transport the statue across the Atlantic? Well, these AI images, although quite cool, are factually incorrect. The statue was deconstructed into over 300 parts, and then shipped across to the States where it was reconstructed. Little did the people know that this would then go on to become one of the most iconic and recognisable attractions across all of the planet. This is Chichen Itza, another wonder of the world. It is found in the state of Yucatan in Mexico, just a couple of hours drive from Cancun. The wonder was believed to have taken a couple of centuries to complete, starting in 700 AD and finishing around 998 AD. It wasn't for another 800 or 900 years later that the ruins were rediscovered. But how exactly? How did this super impressive monument go hidden for so long? Well, it's because it looked like this. It had been fully retaken by Mother Nature, covering most of the structure with grass and shrubs. This is the type of image we're used to seeing when it comes to this wonder. However, when the American explorer John L. Stevens stumbled upon it some 180 years ago, this is what it looked like. Chernobyl is perhaps the most notorious nuclear incident to ever have happened. Put simply, a reactor overheated and exploded, releasing a large amount of radiation into the atmosphere. As this event was the first of its kind, no one knew what the consequences would be. Some feared it would kill millions and or make the rest of Europe uninhabitable. Some even thought that the reactor could melt through the Earth's crust, reaching the core, causing a world-ending event. Luckily, of course, that didn't happen. Now, I'm sure we've all seen photos of what Chernobyl looks like now. It's a completely abandoned city, essentially frozen in time from the 1980s. But what about images from when the city was thriving, when there were actually people living and working there? Prior to the disaster, the Chernobyl region was considered a very modern, well-planned area designed to showcase Soviet ideals of progress and technological achievements. Some 14,000 people called the city home, with another 40,000 living in Pripyat, a nearby city. Both now have an official population of 0. Chernobyl is quite an old city, whereas Pripyat was built specifically to house the people and their families working at the site. And as the USSR wanted to show off their nuclear prowess as well as give its workers nice living conditions, the cities were both thriving, had everything they needed, and were generally great places to live. The Pripyat amusement park is one of the most infamous amusement parks on Earth. It was actually set to open on May 1st, 1986, just a few days after the disaster struck. This means that no one from the public ever got to actually enjoy it. And with the region projected to be uninhabitable for another 20,000 years, it's highly likely that no one ever will. There is a city in Asia that is rather famous for very unfortunate and quite horrifying reasons. It was the first city on Earth to be hit by an atomic bomb, the city in question of course being no other than Hiroshima of Japan. Now, many of you may have learnt about World War II in school and or watched documentaries about it on YouTube. So you might be familiar with images like this. Images of the atomic bomb after its detonation, along with the absolute destruction of this once great city. But how many of you have seen what Hiroshima looked like before the atom bomb was dropped? Well, this is how it looked just weeks before. It was a pretty decently sized city in terms of population, with some 500,000 or so people calling the city home. The city was of great importance to the Japanese. It was a hub for shipbuilding, manufacturing, and was home to many key military installations. Hence why the Americans targeted it. There's a pretty famous and special building that you often see in images of Hiroshima after the blast. It shows this building here which miraculously survived, despite just being 100 meters away from the epicenter. The building still stands today and has been preserved as a peace memorial. Today the city looks like this and its population stands at some 1.2 million. This is Male, the capital city of the Maldives and one of the most densely populated cities in the world. The city is home to approximately 212,000 people, and it spans an area of just 11.2 squared kilometers, resulting in a staggering population density of around 19,000 people per squared kilometer. So this is how the city looks today. From the sky, it's a truly unique looking city, an island where every last bit of space is occupied. The Maldives, however, hasn't always been the luxury destination that it is today. The country didn't officially open up for tourism until 1972. Prior to that, it was largely an isolated, underdeveloped country whose population was only around 120,000. In 1970, this is how Male looked, completely unrecognizable from how it looks today. There are no skyscrapers, no major roads, cars or shipping port. There is also an abundance of trees. Skip forward to today and it's, in some people's eyes, one of the ugliest cities on Earth. Now, the Maldives is known for its tropical setting. The vast majority of people who visit the country simply fly into Male and then leave immediately. No one really wants to visit a densely populated concrete jungle when you have several hundred islands that look like this within a couple hours travel. Speaking of concrete jungles, let's travel some 8,500 kilometers northwest to perhaps the most important city on Earth, London. London is, of course, a rather busy, congested, densely populated city, and as you'd expect of a city of this caliber, its air quality isn't the greatest. It's certainly not as bad as other cities of comparable sizes though. However, in 1952, London, and in fact the UK, saw its deadliest environmental disaster ever, when what is known as the Great Smog hit the city. Due to a combination of cold weather, stagnant air, and heavy coal burning, the city was engulfed in smog filled with toxic pollutants that killed around 12,000 people. This is how the city looked during these several days. Visibility was extremely poor, everyone wore face masks, and Big Ben was all but a dark outline that could barely be recognised. If we travel back another 55 years prior to this event, this is how London looked. This is believed to be one of the first known photos taken of Big Ben. The roads were dominated by horse and carriage, cars were extremely rare, and people dressed in suits amidst the Victorian dictated fashion era. Alright, I've got one final wonder of the world. This time it is the Taj Mahal. The Taj Mahal is perhaps India's most iconic site. Construction started in 1632 and took 16 years to complete. It was famously built by an emperor in memory of his wife who passed away. It's one of the most incredible looking buildings on the planet and easily one of the most famous. But I tell you what isn't as famous is what the building looked like during World War II. Now you might be thinking, what on earth is going on there? Maybe renovations? Well, in order to disguise itself from potential German and Japanese bombing, the British cleverly covered the palace with bamboo. As from above, this would simply look like a stockpile of the material, something not worth wasting bombs on. And, well, it worked. The Taj Mahal luckily survived the war and still stands today. Nearly 100 years prior to the end of World War II is believed to have been when this photo was taken. It was taken in 1850 and is believed to be the first known taken photo of the palace. Throughout time, there have been many iconic photos taken of the Taj, perhaps the most well known being the one of Princess Diana. This is modern day Singapore. It's one of the wealthiest countries on Earth and is known for its high living standards and stunning futuristic architecture. Perhaps the most standout feature of the city-state is its Marina Bay Sands Hotel, which has one of the most eye-catching designs on Earth. It features 3 huge towers with a skyway plonked on top. This skyway is home to the world's largest infinity pool. But this is what the city-state looked like before and during construction of the hotel. This almighty building took around 4 years to build. The project unfortunately took place during the 2008 financial crash, which added some delays. Plans have actually been put in place to build a 4th tower, scheduled to be completed in 2029. Now, I'm sure you've seen many shots like this before of the hotel with the city skyline in the background. You've also then got Gardens by the Bay, which is an urban park known for its giant artificial forest that has daily light shows. Well, let's now take a look at what the area looked like before and during construction. The area is completely unrecognizable from what it looked like a mere 20 years ago. Travel back in time a further 20 years and this is what the city-state looked like. A few skyscrapers here and there, but nothing compared to what we see today. So in the 1960s, the Aral Sea was the 4th largest lake on Earth, but then the USSR diverted the rivers that fed into the lake for large-scale irrigation projects. This caused the levels of water to drop significantly. Now you might be thinking, why is it called the Aral Sea but it's a lake? Well, historically and culturally, most people refer to it as a sea due to its size, but by definition it meets all the requirements to be a lake. In the 1960s, the Aral Sea covered an area of some 68,000 kilometers squared. That's an area a little larger than Sri Lanka. Skip forward to today and it's more like 6,000 kilometers squared, over 10 times smaller. By the 2000s, the lake had split into smaller bodies of water, with some areas completely dried out, leaving behind a desert-like landscape like this. The ecological collapse devastated local fishing industries, destroyed the surrounding ecosystems, and created severe health issues, due to wind-blown toxic dust from the exposed seabed. So overall, it was an ecological, environmental disaster. I'm sure we're all familiar with the Berlin Wall and the images of it falling in November of 1989. It is one of the most important and powerful events in modern history. Images of people smashing and climbing on the wall were shared around the world. But I tell you one thing most people have probably never seen. The opposite, the wall under construction. So believe it or not, the wall was actually built overnight in August of 1961. It was originally just a simple barricade made out of barbed wire. However, as the months went by, this gradually got upgraded to a solid brick wall. After 2 or 3 years, it had become a fully fortified wall with guard towers and reinforced concrete. Skip forward 28 or so years later, a crowd of people climbed on top of the wall and over it and began to demolish it. An event which completely reshaped Germany and, well, Europe. In the 1970s, Beirut was an incredibly vibrant and cosmopolitan city, often referred to as the Paris of the Middle East. It had a buzzing cultural scene with arts, fashion, music and nightlife that drew people from all around the world. The city was a financial and trade hub too, attracting international visitors and businesses. However, these positives unfortunately ended with the outbreak of the Lebanese Civil War in 1975. The war, which lasted around 15 years, was messy and complicated, and as you'd expect, as the war dragged on, much of Beirut's once thriving districts were destroyed. This led to a complete and utter collapse of what was known as the glory days of Lebanon and Beirut. So there we have it, some interesting historical photos of famous cities and places from around the world. If you enjoy this sort of content, like and subscribe for part 2. And as always, thank you very much for watching.